Vamos começando. Boa tarde a todos e a todas, sejam bem-vindas e bem-vindos e obrigada desde já pela vossa presença e adesão a este webinar. É de facto com grande entusiasmo que damos início ao mesmo, não é? Portanto, este webinar é promovido no âmbito das atividades da Rede de Instituições de Ensino Superior de Educação Relacional, do qual o Relational Lab faz parte e do qual eu também, a Mónica, faço parte, com a instituição também que faz parte desta rede, a Escola Superior de Educação Paula Francinetti, e a minha colega Joana Cruz, que também faz parte desta rede no âmbito do Centro de Investigação da Psicologia do Desenvolvimento. Portanto, só aqui enquadrando um bocadinho o que é esta rede. Esta rede de instituições de ensino superior de educação relacional é uma iniciativa colaborativa, de certa forma até inovadora, que reúne diversas instituições de ensino superior ligadas à educação e que têm em comum este compromisso robusto, sólido, com uma abordagem efetivamente educativa e centrada naquilo que são as relações humanas. Ao promovermos a empatia, o respeito, a cooperação e o bem-estar, e nós acreditamos muito nestes valores nos contextos educativos, a Rede de Instituições de Ensino Superior de Educação Relacional pretende influenciar positivamente todas as práticas pedagógicas, construir efetivamente também projetos de investigação e desenvolver atividades comunitárias interinstitucionais para que possamos contribuir assim efetivamente para ambientes educativos que sejam mais inclusivos, acolhedores, eficazes e naturalmente relacionais. Entre as instituições que integram esta rede, podemos destacar universidades e institutos politécnicos a nível nacional, que conjuntamente estamos a desenvolver ações destinadas às escolas, até às próprias comunidades académicas, e impulsionar assim a reflexão crítica sobre as relações interpessoais nos contextos educativos e partilhar conhecimentos, experiências e também recursos que permitam às escolas algum apoio da academia para promoverem uma educação verdadeiramente inclusiva e verdadeiramente relacional. Aqui neste webinar vamos ter a oportunidade de explorar algumas estratégias, alguns desafios e algumas boas práticas que possam reforçar aqui o compromisso tanto da rede como das vossas comunidades e daquilo que é a vossa realidade, e reforçar assim o compromisso que as escolas têm com a inclusão educativa. Portanto, nós queremos efetivamente, e esperamos que consigam este enfoque hoje, abordar formas concretas para apoiar alunos, docentes e comunidades educativas no geral num processo que seja centrado na valorização das relações interpessoais e com isso também no verdadeiro sentido da inclusão. Como vocês sabem, portanto, temos aqui dois oradores convidados que são, portanto, a sua língua materna em inglês e, portanto, a apresentação será em inglês. Por isso, eles estão disponíveis para responder algumas questões no chat, portanto, coloquem essas questões, se quiserem ir colocando ao longo da apresentação, coloquem essas questões em inglês no chat, mas também teremos no final um momento também para debatermos algumas questões em conjunto. O webinar conta com a tradução simultânea, ok? Portanto, tem essa opção disponível. Para ativar essa tradução, basta clicar no ícone interpretação, que vocês encontram na barra de ferramentas do Zoom em baixo, e selecionam a língua português.
Boa tarde. Cabe-me a mim apresentar os dois profissionais que irão estar connosco nesta tarde e que têm uma vasta experiência no apoio a escolas no Reino Unido. Uma das oradoras, Catherine Dunnett, é psicóloga educacional sénior, especializada no trabalho com escolas para apoiar crianças e jovens em situação de acolhimento. O orador é Matt Jones, professor consultor na área da saúde mental, emocional e social, com percurso como professor no primeiro ciclo e coordenador de apoio a alunos com necessidades educativas especiais no Reino Unido. Ambos lideram um projeto inovador desenvolvido em Devon que visa apoiar as escolas na adoção de práticas relacionais como alternativa ao aumento de políticas punitivas no tratamento de comportamentos desafiantes, sobretudo no ensino secundário, e práticas estas que têm afetado de forma desproporcional alunos de grupos mais vulneráveis. O projeto que vão apresentar inclui a elaboração de orientações práticas, a criação de recursos online e o acompanhamento direto de duas escolas, uma escola primária e uma escola secundária, com o objetivo de as transformar naquilo que designam de escolas modelo, que sejam capazes de demonstrar e disseminar boas práticas relacionais. O projeto conta já com 3 anos E neste momento a escola secundária de Devon destaca-se como exemplo de transformação relacional bem-sucedida, gerando crescente interesse nesta abordagem, tanto em Devon como noutras regiões do Reino Unido. Assim, integrado na missão da Rede de Instituições de Ensino Superior de Educação Relacional, este webinar convida à reflexão e ao diálogo sobre as mudanças necessárias para construirmos ambientes educativos mais inclusivos e centrados nas relações, onde todas as crianças e jovens se sintam reconhecidos, apoiados e com oportunidades para crescer. Esperamos, por isso, que seja um momento de partilha e oportunidade para todos nós. Vou passar agora a palavra para os oradores e, por isso, vou mudar para a versão em inglês. So, dear Catherine and Matt, we would like to extend our sincere thanks for being with us today. You have already been introduced, and we are very much looking forward to hearing about the experience and insights you bring to this important conversation. Without further delay, we kindly invite you to begin your presentation. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting us. We're really pleased to talk about our work in terms of supporting schools here in Devon, in the southwest of England, to develop their relational practice and some of the procedures and policies that support schools to be as relational as they possibly can be. Sophia and the team, thank you. It's really nice for us to spend some time speaking to like-minded people. I'm going to share a screen. Here we go. We've put together some slides to help tell the story or explain a little bit about our work on relational practice. Let me just check that that is working. Can you see individual slides, or is it all of them at the moment? All of them?
All of them, yeah.
Yeah, let me just try again. Hopefully. It's not quite doing shares.
Maybe it is in a different window, no?
I tell you what I'll do. I'll just stop sharing and then come back.
Yeah.
And then hopefully it will share better this time. Oh, and you got to see us on the big screen momentarily, which will have been nice. Right, let's go to slideshow.
Is that okay? Can we just go with that?
Can you still see that okay well enough?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's
Sure.
not quite full screen as it was, but it's okay. So for the last few years here in Devon, in the southwest of England, Catherine and I have been supporting schools to be brave enough and strong enough and creative enough to move away from being very traditional and behaviorist in terms of how they manage the students in their schools. And we don't think it was historically always been the case. And both Catherine and I remember being at both primary school and secondary school and feeling supported and feeling looked after and feeling cared for. But certainly in the last, I don't know, Catherine, 10, 15 years, schools, particularly secondary schools that are taking children from the age of 11 to 16 or 11 to 18 have been very behaviorist in terms of their approaches and have at times become very punitive in terms of how they try to manage behavior in school. And for Catherine and I, supporting the most vulnerable young people, whether these are children with social, emotional, mental health needs, or children in care, or children who have experienced trauma or adversity, these punitive systems have been disastrous in terms of how they have left those children, and many of which have either been excluded from school or end up not attending school and staying at home. We're also really interested in what it does to the wider culture and climate of a school. So even those children who won't be on the receiving end of the behaviourist system tend not to feel very happy, supported, understood, and often are really struggling to feel safe in school because they are fearful of the behaviourist systems that exist.
Yeah.
And so Catherine and I want to talk a little bit about the background of why we were tasked with supporting our schools to become more relational. And then what we want to do as we discuss Sophia is to move towards the very kind of practical applications of being relational in school and what that means in terms of how we enable children to feel safe, connected, understood, and cared for. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about the background to our work. Does that make sense, Catherine?
Yeah. So as well as becoming quite concerned really about the direction that some of our schools were going in, particularly as a response to a perceived understanding that behaviour was getting more difficult to manage. There's also a huge amount of research that says that relational practice and policies are much better for schools. So there's lots of, one of our starting points was a big review of exclusions that was carried out in the UK a few years ago, which looked at what happened to children who are excluded from school. And what came across very clearly in that research was that children were excluded from school. Their short-term and long-term outcomes were very, very poor. And that impacted on their mental health, their employability, their families, and in the long term. And in the short term, lots of these children never went back to school. So one of our starting points really was to try to get schools to think about their exclusion levels. And some of our schools were saying, well, we need to exclude these children from school because it means that they can get what they need. But what the research showed very clearly was that exclusion is never in the best interest of a child. We also looked at lots of research on behavioural management systems and practices, and looked at what was really good evidence-based practice and pulled that together with our understanding of the most recent research in terms of neuroscience and attachment theory. I think that the developments in neuroscience have led to a completely different understanding of behaviour and really helped us to understand why children, why adults as well might behave the way that they do. We were at a conference quite recently where the speaker said that schools have now got an ethical responsibility to update their behaviour policies in the light of the most recent neuroscience and psychology. So that's really what we have tried to do, and we've tried to present the schools in Devon with an alternative to the more behaviourist behaviour policies that they were starting to pursue.
Interestingly, although our starting point as an educational psychologist and an advisory teacher for social and emotional mental health was thinking about the most vulnerable children, thinking about those that needed the greatest help, those that had interruptions in terms of their relationships, we were really keen to explain to schools here in Devon that this is beneficial for all children. This is beneficial for children who will never come into contact with the behaviourist system. This is beneficial to learning, not just behaviour, not just regulation. And so we help our schools think about how this is about supporting the well-being and the sense of belonging of all young people in school. It is vital for our most vulnerable children. The final thing we support our schools to do is to understand that this is as much about adult well-being and adult regulation and adult relationships as it is student relationships. And so one of the things which is unfortunate, but feels as though it's been supportive for our narrative in helping schools, is that the schools in Devon that are most interested in zero tolerance and in behaviourist and punitive systems do not have happy members of staff. And so one of the things we've been really trying to support our schools to do when becoming more relational is to think as much about how they behave relationally to the adults as they do the students. I think the very final thing I wanted to say, Catherine, is that in our schools that have understood this most, they think about this work as much about teaching and learning as they do about behavior and attendance. And we think that that's really interesting, because for some of our schools in Devon that are keen to be involved, they are keen to see better behavior. And we understand that, but we also want them to think about there being better learning and a better sense of belonging and a better sense of school community where the behavior is also better.
This is a really nice quote from two people who you're probably aware of in terms of thinking about our most vulnerable children in schools, Dan Hughes and Louise Bomber, who contributed quite a lot to our thinking around the relational approach. And really what they are saying, which is based on huge amounts of research and theory, is that it's relationships that children need. One of the things that we find in some of our Devon schools is that when there's a child who has quite a high level of need and is presenting with maybe a history of trauma or attachment difficulties, what happens sometimes in schools is that the adults who are working with that child has huge empathy for that child. But what they tend to do is step back from that child and they start thinking, there's nothing I can do. This child has had such terrible things happen to them. They've got such challenges in terms of their well-being and perhaps their behavior, that this is beyond my level of expertise. And one of the things that we really try to do is we try to impress on people that it isn't the therapy that a child has or input from outside professionals. It's the relationships that they have from the people who they're seeing every single day. And it's those relationships that will make the difference for that child. So rather than stepping back and putting them on a waiting list to see a mental health professional, step forward, because it's the little things that you can do in your relationship which will have a massive impact on that child.
So what Catherine's just said, I think, is we don't want to burden teachers with more stuff to do. We don't want this work weighing heavy around their neck, but we do really want them to understand, all of you teachers that are here listening to this, we really want you to understand that you are the greatest resource in your school. Your interactions are enough to make the biggest difference for those children. When I was a primary school teacher and I was the special educational needs coordinator, often a member of staff would come to see me to say, I'm working with this child, what should I do? And I would look for resources, look for games, look for activities, look for worksheets, look for handouts. And really what I wish now I would have said to them is, it's you that can make the difference. The way that you greet that child, the way that you interact with that child, the way that you regulate that child, the way that you show repair with that child, the way that you hold them in mind, the way that you are playful and curious and empathic. And if our work has been success, or the biggest success in our work has been trying and at times achieving empowering individuals in schools to recognize that they are the most important factor in terms of enabling that child to be successful. Nonetheless, we did spend some time writing some materials. I think because in some respects, we wanted to make it all feel official and that this was a proper thing that the schools could do. It was proper. What we were also really aware of is our schools that were very behaviorist, working with very traditional behaviorist ideas, we felt that what they were doing was flawed. We thought that it was really unhelpful for our most vulnerable children. However, their behaviorist systems were very clear. A child would struggle or arrive late or sometimes not be wearing the right uniform or not even tucking their shirt in, and they would get a warning and a warning, and they would be sent out. Now, for staff that were feeling overwhelmed, or for staff that find regulation quite hard work, that system feels very clear for them, and therefore to some degree they liked it. I don't know if like is the wrong word.
It was easy.
It was easy. We know what to do. You say warning, and then you send them out. So what we wanted to do was to help them understand how they needed to develop some skills and needed to develop some understanding and some language. But we also wanted the approach, when it was going to be relational, to be clear, to be easy for them to call upon that. Some of our schools who started this journey with us told staff to be more relational and then closed the classroom door. And for some members of staff, that was really unhelpful, because you took away the one thing that they felt they had control of, which was the behavior system. So what we needed to do was to describe a new type of system with a new set of skills to help people understand that it was possible to do something different. We hope everyone's okay. There's lots of information. There's some nice nodding now. We developed a model to help people think about relational practice. There were 3 parts to our model. In a few minutes, we'll explore the first part of the model in more depth, because there's some real practical support ideas there that we think will be helpful for people within this meeting. But we just want to briefly tell you about the 3 parts of the model, because we think it's important to know. The first part is about how we support our school communities to develop relationships, and the processes that are involved in supporting the development of relationships, including, really importantly, how we establish together boundaries and how we ensure that we have processes to describe and express ourselves within those boundaries. We'll talk about it more in a few minutes, but to us, it is a really important message that working relationally doesn't mean soft and permissive. In fact, we would argue that working relationally has higher expectations on young people than just warning out. We think that there's more involvement and engagement with students when working relationally, which invites them and challenges them to think really hard about their behavior and about the impact their behavior has on others. The first bit of the model is about developing relationships. The second part of the model is about how we try to use our relationships when things start to bubble or wobble or start to go wrong. How do we respond in a way that is more likely to calm situations and de-escalate rather than escalate? One of the things that we noticed over time, particularly in our secondary schools with older students, is the response of teachers, particularly when they were being very behaviorist and very punitive, escalated situations. So lower level incidents would very quickly turn into high level incidents because of the response of the adult. And sometimes all the adult was doing was using the school behavior system. The first bit is about developing, the second bit is about responding in the moment, and the third and final part of our model is about how we repair relationships when things go wrong. And just really briefly on that, for Catherine and I, for our work, when it comes to supporting children in care, children that have been removed from their birth parents and are adopted or are in foster care, the third part of the model is so important for them to understand. Many of those children have the understanding that when something goes wrong, relationships end. And it's so important that our most vulnerable children understand that our relationships can come back even stronger as long as we repair and restore relationships.
It's also through that repairing and restoring that children and young people learn what went wrong and why things might have happened. So it's a really important process, isn't it? Because it's not just about the repair, it's about a learning for everybody involved. So particularly when there's a conflict between a teacher and a child, the teacher obviously learns a lot about what that child needs, and it can bring about huge transformation in the way that child is being taught. And that is something that tends to be missed in more traditional behaviour management processes, because there's just some punishment and then that's supposed to do the trick, and then the child is going to come back and able to behave in a way that we want them to, but yet we haven't been through that learning process with them.
I think as well, like sometimes there isn't in more traditional behaviorist systems, there almost for young people doesn't seem the need for any repair, because of the idea that I did the crime, I've done the bad thing, but it's okay, I've done the time. Mm-hmm. You've extracted your punishment upon me. I think sometimes, but I mean, this is quite a challenging thing to say. And some of our schools in Devon have found this hard, but we do think that most behaviorist systems are about practicing revenge.
What's your recent phrase? What doesn't get repaired gets repeated.
What doesn't get repaired gets repeated.
Yeah. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to think about just one little bit of the model. So you're welcome to download this and use the whole materials, but just to make this quite short session, just as practical as possible, we just want to focus on our relational model, which we pulled together using different bits of theory, you know, from psychology and different bits of research. And the model is that a relationship is about providing protection, connection, understanding, and care. And that if you say to lots of different people, you know, develop a relationship, or it's all about relationship, different people will tell you that relationships are different things. Some people believe that they're really intuitive, that people just know how to do them, and that you can either do it or you can't. What we tried to do was really develop a model which says this is what young people need from a relationship from adults. These are the core strands to a relationship, and then to dig a little bit further into what all of those four things mean, so that people can actually learn how to do it if they don't think that it's coming naturally to them. And different people will form relationships in different ways, but these are the things that children need to get from a relationship with an adult. So in order to understand that, we're just going to do a very slight little bit of theory, sort of underlying neuroscience. So what people need to understand is what behavior is, and how behavior doesn't exist as something that is separate from our underlying feelings or our underlying emotions. It doesn't exist as something that is separate, and therefore it can't be managed or changed if it's just dealt with on its own. So we need to understand where the behavior is emerging from, and we need to see behavior as emerging from our underlying physiology and our underlying emotional processes. And we also need to understand the role that relationships play in development. So different people will have different understanding of the world around them because of the experiences that they have had. And what we need to understand is how that affects how our brain works, how that affects how our physiology works. And most importantly, what we need to do to address those underlying needs. So one of the things that we used to pull together the model was this model of neuroception, which comes from Stephen Porges' much wider body of work, the polyvagal theory. I'm sure that lots of you are familiar with this. But essentially what this model says is that we are always in one of three autonomic states. We're either on our safety pathway, which leads to social engagement, on our danger pathway, which leads to mobilization, or life threat, which leads to immobilization. So all the time we're taking in information from our environment to work out whether we're safe or not. And whether we have a neuroception of safety or not will very much be dictated by our prior experiences. So according to whether we feel safe or not, we'll be triggered into different autonomic states. When we're on our danger or life threat pathways, we're either mobilized, so heart rate up, breathing rate up, digestive system going faster, or immobilized, sort of the opposite, so breathing rate down, heart rate down. And they're adaptations to keep us safe. So we're either getting ready to run or fight, or we're freezing to sort of evolutionary to con a predator into thinking that that we're not alive or not dangerous to them. When we're on those pathways, our social engagement system shuts down. So when we're on our pathways, we don't really have access to this channel, which is the ventral vagal regulation, which controls our social engagement. Is there any way that you can change that so we can see that?
Oh, you want me to change this?
Yeah. Is that? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So when we're in our danger or life threat pathways, we're either mobilized or immobilized, and you can see that our social engagement systems shut down. When we're on our safety pathway, our social engagement systems are open to us. So we can talk to other people, we can listen, we can learn, we can use our ears to pick up different intonation, we can use our facial expressions to connect with other people. And the more that we do that, the more that we socially engage, the more our cortex develops. So that arrow goes in one direction, but really it should also go in the other direction as well, because the more social engagement we have, the more developed the cortex becomes, and the more able we are to perceive a sense of safety. So we know that there are certain things that help us to feel safe. Warm and open facial expressions, a calm and open voice modulation that mimics possibly some of our earliest interaction, certain body movements that are in synchronicity with our own. So the more developed the cortex becomes, the more we're able to pick up those safety cues, the more we're able to feel safe, the more we're able to socially engage, the better our cortex becomes at picking up those safety cues. Children who haven't had a lot of safety in their life tend to have been on those pathways. So what can happen is children can get stuck here. So because they don't feel safe, their social engagement pathways shut down. Because they're not socially engaging, the cortex doesn't develop. So because the cortex doesn't develop, they're not able to pick up a sense of safety. So what we need to do is put this science into practice, really, and start to understand what young people need from us in terms of relationships. So what we need, first of all, is to make sure that children feel safe, because if they don't feel safe, they can't listen, they can't learn, they can't explore, and their social engagement systems shut down, and that cortex doesn't develop. The next thing we need to do is, when children are feeling safe, we need to socially engage with them, because it's through social engagement that they're going to develop that cortex. So we need to connect with them. We also need to understand what happens when they are feeling that like they're in danger, or feeling like they're in life threat, and they've gone onto those mobilization and immobilization pathways. So we need to learn how to understand the behavior that emerges from that and learn how to regulate them. And we also need to care for them. So we need to wrap all that up with a high level of care that meets their need for relationships and attachment. And we're not going to go into that theory today, but that's the other sort of branch that sort of underpins our model. So the first thing we're going to do is to talk a little bit about protection and how we support children to feel safe.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah,
Is that
yeah.
all right? That was a super quick. That's neuroscience in about 3 minutes. And we recognize not the lunacy of that,
Yeah.
but we know that the work of Stephen Porges cannot really be condensed down into a few minutes. However, I think everyone here who has expressed an interest in coming to one of these workshops organized by the Relational Lab doesn't need convincing of this work, okay? However, there will be staff in your schools, there will be people interacting with children tomorrow morning who do not have a good understanding of this. And when Catherine and I began this work, we used to call on purely really on attachment theory, trauma, and adverse experiences. And what it did is it kind of pulled on the heartstrings of staff in schools. Interestingly, for the staff that were already very empathic and compassionate and kind, pulling on the heartstrings simply added to their sense of purpose and agency. But sometimes for the senior leaders or for some of the hard to reach members of staff, pulling on the heartstrings didn't do it. And I'm not suggesting they're cold and heartless, but the neuroscience appealed to their brains. And somewhere, for those people that were finding behavior hard to understand, the neuroscience provided an understanding that attachment theory and understanding trauma didn't seem to do. So as part of our materials that you can download, and there's a link in a minute and we can put it in the chat and Sophia's got it, etc. As part of the materials, there's a wider, more detailed explanation of some of that neuroscience, which can help reach some of the members of staff that might be struggling to understand.
Yeah.
We'll just quickly go through some of protection, connection, understanding, and care.
Yeah. Should I do that? Do you want to do that?
Go on, you do protection, I'll do social control.
Okay, so one of the things that is absolutely vital is that children feel safe within school. So we need to work out how we're going to make children feel safe. So the first thing that adults need to do is to become a source of safety for the children through their relationship. So they become a safe base for the children from which they can then go off and learn and explore. So the first thing that we know is really important about providing that sense of safety is providing those safety cues. So having a warm facial expression, having body language that isn't threatening, that synchronizes with their own, having a voice which mirrors the very earliest interaction that children might have experienced. They're the safety cues that we need in order to feel safe. That doesn't necessarily mean we need somebody to be all smiley and jolly all the time. We need somebody who can attune to us. So if we're feeling a little bit stressed, our faces are a little bit stressed, our voices sound a little bit stressed, what we need is to see that reflected back in the other person so that we know that they get us, so that we know that we're understood and that people are with us. The next thing that we know is really important is to do with consistency, predictability, and reliability, because they're the things that enable children to trust. There is a little bit of a sort of caveat around that, in that consistency often comes up in research around behaviour, but we don't consider consistent to be doing the same for every single child in every single situation. What we mean by consistency is that each individual child receives a very predictable response. So what children need is predictability. We don't want systems where there's a rigid structure, where every child is always treated the same, because adults need to attune to the children that they're working with and to be responsive. But if adults always respond in a way that's predictable, then that's what children need. And the children that we've worked with are absolutely okay with that, because what some of our schools say is that, but you can't do that, you have to do the same for every child. But what the young people are telling us is that they don't really mind about that. What they want to see is a predictable response that shows empathy and understanding. There needs to be very clear structures, routines, boundaries and containment. Matt's going to talk about boundaries and containment in a minute. So again, structure and routine are things that enable us to be predictable. And again, they don't need to be rigid. They need to be responsive, but chaos is not, doesn't make children feel safe. So they need to be contained within structures and routines that they're very familiar with. We also need to think about how the environment helps to make children feel safe in terms of the sensory environment. So some children who've experienced trauma, early attachment needs, are triggered onto their stress response by the sensory environment. So thinking about what particularly children need and managing that environment in terms of the sensory load can be quite important. We also need to think about behaviour management responses. So some of the behaviour management responses that some of our schools are adopting are actually the cause of stress for some children and push them further into their defence responses. And the last one, we know that lots of our more vulnerable children really trigger with things like change and uncertainty, any kind of novelty, transitions, challenge, so believing that they can't do something that they're being asked to do. And for some of our children, those things need managing, highly managing. So lots of preparation for change, lots of preparation for novelty, challenge being delivered in a particular way so that they know that it's okay to make mistakes, and being given work that matches their ability. So just move on to the next slide.
For some staff, I almost argue quite a lot of staff, particularly in our secondary schools, working with older students here in England, trying to work out how to be both warm and firm, how to be both kind and clear. Lots of the systems within our more behaviorist schools have told adults to be very strict and very cross and have deep booming voices and at times quite intimidatory body language and blank faces. When they first hear that a relational approach is going to do something different, their perception is it will be soft and permissive and paternalistic. We use this, the social control window, often used greatly within restorative practice, to help staff understand that our young people need to be in schools with adults who can provide both high levels of clearness, at times firmness, be assertive, be a source of authority with a warmth, a care, a kindness, and a compassion. And what Catherine and I have discovered in working for the last a good number of years with our schools is helping them work out what authoritative looks like is the biggest mission for their practice. They'll need procedures and policies that support them, but the practice on the ground needs to be authoritative. So when we embark with a new school, when a new school embarks on working with us to become relational, on the first day, we sit down with the leadership team and we invite them to think about what does authority look like in a relational school? And we think that that is a really interesting mission for a leadership team to consider. What does authority look like in a relational school? And that little top right quadrant of the social control window is really where we invite schools to start exploring that question. We've done protection, let's do connection.
Okay, so connection is really important because it's through connection that development is going to take place. And this is something that I think some teachers can forget. And certainly in the UK, because of the current trends in pedagogy, there is not as much connection in the classroom as we would like. So there's definitely a move to a more didactic teaching style where a teacher is just delivering information for a child. So what we want is there to be reciprocal interaction, so two-way interaction, and interaction for interaction's sake. So not just about giving information or receiving information, but social connection, social engagement. If we had a really long time, we'd talk quite extensively about the work of a psychologist called Colwyn Trevarthen, who studied early connection in infants and had a very strong belief that connection was the most important thing for development, and that it was a human right for people, and did a lot of work in looking at how we connect and how our connection supports our development as we go through life. So he talked about the very first connection that we experience being to do with being in time and rhythm with others. And whilst that's our first experience of connection, we go on seeking connection like that all the way through life. So we choose to sing together, to dance together. You know, we chant together on protests, people chant in football stadiums, we sing together in places of worship. We seek connection that is to do with being in time and rhythm with others, because when we do that, our brains get flooded with oxytocin, we feel good, and we become even more receptive to social engagement. You know, in the COVID pandemic in the UK, everybody went out on a Thursday evening and clapped for the National Health Service. And it was, you know, people did it because we were clapping for the National Health Service, but it was also about bringing neighbours together, enabling people to see each other. And there were videos, weren't there, from all over the world of people doing that, of developing sort of connection activities. And quite a lot of that were to do with people being in time and rhythm with one another. And then we move on from being in time and rhythm to starting to take turns, and lots of opportunities to take turns with other people is really important, because that's when we develop reciprocity. So that's where we start to understand that we can influence other people and other people can influence us. And that's really key learning in terms of being able to socially engage, not just with one person, but you know, as a society, allowing others to influence you and understanding your influence on other people. And the more children have opportunities to connect through songs and games and activities that support connection, the more their brains develop, the more they start to understand, okay, so when I do this, this happens. This is what I think this person thinks. This is what I think this person feels. And children start to understand other people. They understand themselves in the context of other people. And they move from being able to interact just with one other person to being able to interact in a group, to being able to interact in society. And it's through increasing the complicated opportunities for connection that enables children to do that. So we move from just being in time and rhythm with another, where we just feel that we're not alone, we're with other people, to reciprocally interacting with others, where we understand our role in that relationship. And then we move on to understanding how we are in groups. So we start to develop what Colwyn Trevathan calls our common sense. We have a common understanding of what's okay and what isn't okay. And as those connection activities become more complicated as we go through school and we start to collaborate in groups together, we start to develop our own kind of moral and ethical code. So we move way beyond behaviorism, where we're just responding to rewards and sanctions. We're starting to work out how we need to be, because we understand that, and we understand how we do impacts on other people. So opportunities for connection is really important, right from those very early experiences of being in time and rhythm, right to more complicated collaborative work. And building that into the curriculum is really important. I think in the UK, a lot of young people get their experience of connection through extracurricular activities. So playing sport, doing dancing, drama, music, and they're brilliant, they're fantastic. But we also need to work out how to bring connection into the classroom where children are actually learning. So how do we do that? How do we have a teaching pedagogy that is about collaboration and cooperation?
Interestingly, in terms of that, I love it when Catherine talks about this work, the development of a moral code. Interestingly, in our education system in England, in our very early years, when the children are at their very youngest, in their nurseries, when they're like 3 and 4, and then at the start of primary school at 5 and 6, there's loads of conversations and discussions and circle time when they're talking about how to be together, what they need from each other. They're talking about morals and ethics. As children move through our education system, in which it becomes increasingly more reward, sanction, punitive, it's almost like it moves away from developing a moral code, and it simply suggests that school is about being compliant.
Yeah.
So as children get older and could engage more in moral, ethical debates, they don't see that happening as part of their education. So we do think that supporting relational practice in terms of protection, connection, understanding, and care is far more than just about behavior and regulation. I mean, let's imagine an education system which is about developing an ethical and moral code. That's like why you should become a teacher. The 4 areas, we're nearly there, and we're going to pause and we'll have questions or a lie down, whatever's needed. Protection, connection, understanding, and care. The understanding section is about supporting staff to develop a curiosity around what that behavior means, to look beyond the expression of the behavior, to work out the thoughts and feelings that might be contributing. And Catherine used a word a couple of times earlier on. She said that when things are difficult, there is a change in our physiology, a change in what's happening in our body. And she said, and our behavior emerges out of that. As part of supporting schools in England to develop relational practice, we are inviting them a lot to reflect on this idea that behavior emerges. It is not often, particularly for our most vulnerable children, a well thought through choice. And if it is not a choice, it doesn't seem to make sense to try to modify that behavior through reward and sanction. We need to work out what's really going on and try to meet that underlying need. And sometimes that will take a level of curiosity and understanding, which might need a small group of people to help think about. Do you want to talk about this?
Yep. So within the materials, there is something called a responsive co-regulation plan. So we suggest that this is used for children where they are really struggling with their regulation. They're often triggered onto those safety or danger pathways. And they're not able to make a choice because they're just being subconsciously triggered onto those pathways. And what they need is a regulatory response. So they need to have somebody who's regulating them. So this is a good kind of plan that you can use where people get together to talk about what the child needs. So they first of all talk about what the child looks like when they're at different stages of dysregulation. And then they agree a response for each different stage. Have we got time to go through that?
No, I don't think we should, but it's all there in the resources.
Yeah.
We'll talk briefly about care, and then we've got a couple more slides, and then we'll...
Yeah. So the last part of the model is care, and care really is about making sure that you're meeting children's basic needs. But if you meet a child's basic needs, you know, if you buy them some breakfast, or if you zip their coat up because it's cold, or if you show an interest in whether they're safe or not, or you're not just looking after their basic needs, you're showing that you think about them even when they're not there. You're showing that they are worthy of your attention and your time and your thought. And what you're actually doing is meeting their attachment needs. So what this does is it helps children to feel that they are worthy of other people, that they are likable, that they are lovable, and it improves their self-esteem and also their self-efficacy and self-agency, because what they experience is somebody doing something for them in response to their needs. So lots of children who are very vulnerable develop a real sort of self-helplessness. But actually, if they experience somebody who's responding to them, they start to understand that they are worthy of somebody's time and attention, that what they think does make a difference, that they can make choices and they can affect change in their life. So there's a psychologist called Dan Hughes, who talks a lot about care, and he talks about is there a quote there? No. And he talks about how you need to hold people in mind, hold children in mind, and holding children in mind is a really important part of this. So because lots of our vulnerable children never think that they are thought about unless they're there. They never think that anybody cares about them unless they're, doing something that gets that person's attention. But saying to a child after a weekend, hey, I was thinking about you at the weekend. I was thinking that you were going swimming and I was wondering if you were having a really nice time. You're showing that child, you're holding them in your mind, you're showing them that you think about them, that they're important, that they're worthy of your thoughts, even when they're not there. So holding them in mind is a concept that we talk about quite a lot. Dan Hughes took that a little bit further and talked about holding children in your minds and hearts. And that's really what this care section is about.
Just a very brief recap. When supporting adults in schools to develop relational practice, it is useful to have a framework to think about it, not to dissect it to death, not so that it becomes formulaic and robotic, but so that there can be a shared conversation and a shared reflection on how are we meeting the relational needs of the children in our school. Are there children here that don't feel safe? They don't feel protected through relationships? Are there children that have become disconnected, and how can we enable them to feel a sense of belonging? How can we help the children understand themselves, and how can we let them know that they are cared for? So in our work in Devon in the UK, we developed some tools to support schools in putting together relational support plans. Now, we are nervous about this over time because what some schools believed was that this was a paper activity, and as long as you had lots of different bits of paper, you were doing relational practice really well. We consider relational support plans to be about a process by which a small team of adults get together to consider a young person in terms of protection, connection, understanding, and care. And what Catherine and I put together is this a template with some supporting questions so that that team could have a meaningful discussion about that young person in terms of protection, connection, understanding, and care. I want to say two things before the final slide.
Yeah.
One is, what some schools did is they thought about this for a whole class or even a whole school. How do we ensure that as a school we're protected, connected, understood, and cared for? What do we do for each other? What do our days look like in terms of this? Sometimes they did that for classes, even a whole school, not just for individual children. And the final thing that I wanted to say is, what we have learned over the last number of years doing this with some schools in Devon is, if adults in school, if the grown-ups don't feel protected, connected, understood, and cared for, it's almost impossible to do it with the children. So the way that we behave towards each other as adults, if it is not like this, we shouldn't be surprised if staff cannot do it. So all of the materials can be found here, and maybe Sophia, I should send you the slideshow and the links, and you could forward it to everyone that's been in the meeting and all of that.
Yep.
All of the templates, all of the prompts are all there. We just wanted to do one more slide, Sophia, and then we'll stop and see if there's any questions or thoughts or comments. And the slide really is a potential process for moving schools towards becoming more relational, because it's not about stopping what we're doing now and starting that tomorrow. it's about a process. Do you want to just talk about that briefly, Catherine?
Yeah, so I think what we've learned has been really important is that there needs to be a very clear vision. So I think everybody in the school needs to know what a relational approach actually is. Some of our schools set off doing this without really having an idea of where they were going and what it looked like. And that really needs to be led and modelled by a very strong senior leadership team. And then you can't just tell people to be more relational. There's a lot of training needed. And that's training of staff and training of students as well, in terms of developing their understanding of what we really mean by a relational approach and relationships. At the same time, we think that there definitely needs to be an emphasis on staff well-being, because this is harder than using traditional approaches, and so staff really need to feel
it's more demanding.
Like they are, yeah, because you're not asking people to just use a different worksheet or teach maths in a different way. You're asking people to form relationships, and so ultimately it means that people think about their own relationships, and they are, you know, affected, but much more by what's happening. And then gradually you need to develop new systems. You can't just do it with the old systems, and a relational approach needs just as many and just as rigorous systems as a traditional approach does. You know, if you're going to have a lot of restorative work, how is that going to happen? You know, the school that we've been working with a lot in Devon has developed completely new systems, including having restorative workshops after school, and a completely different system for what happens when children do need to be removed from a classroom. And then once the new systems are working really well, you can drop off the old systems. And we would suggest that it happens that way and not the other way, because you don't want people to be left feeling that they're not held by any kind of system at all. And then this needs to be driven forward, really, I think, by two different groups of people. A strategy group, so that's your senior leadership, really, who is thinking about when to make changes, what to do, when to implement new systems, and a practice group. And the practice group is made up of a group of members of staff from different areas of the school and sort of different positions in the hierarchy, for want of a better word. And they are the people who are the sort of eyes and ears on the ground. They are working out what's working, what isn't working, what skills need to develop, what people are doing well, what people are struggling with. And they do that on the ground problem solving and feed information up to the strategy group, so that it all feels very joined up. So we've got a bottom up and a top down thing going on. It's not just something that's being driven by leadership and other people are just having to do what they're being told. It's actually being developed from the ground as well. And everybody is listening to each other and working together really well.
Catherine said, it's a final thing. Catherine said, one of the reasons to have a strand on staff well-being is that it is harder to do this than it is pure behaviorism and stuff. One of the things that we've been really pleased to hear from the schools that we've supported intensely in Devon, here in the Southwest, because we want them to be able to show other schools a way. We want other schools that are interested in this to come and have a look at that school. One of the things that we have been repeatedly told by different members of staff in that school, they said, working relationally is harder, but it feels right. It's why I became a teacher. It's what I want to spend my time doing. And that was, I don't know, we enjoyed hearing that, didn't we, Catherine? I'm just going to put that little link up again. But as said, Sophia, I'll send you stuff and you can send round. That's a lot of talking. Goodness me. Poor people.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Matt, for sharing your valuable insights and inspiring experience with us today. It was truly enlightening and it's really interesting, and I'm going to inspire myself in your link. Thank you. Agora vamos então abrir espaço para algumas perguntas. Convido-vos a colocarem as vossas perguntas no chat ou, se preferirem, oralmente, colocando a mão no ar. Não sei se vão ser assim tantas, mas sintam-se à vontade para aproveitar este momento para perceberem mais sobre este modelo ou compreenderem melhor a aplicabilidade deste modelo que nos foi aqui apresentado. Como eu costumo brincar, um de cada vez, por favor. Não há? Ninguém tem questões? Bem, eu tenho. Temos aqui, esperem aí. Temos aqui a Joana.
Hello.
Joana vai colocar alguma questão?
Sim. Should I go right away in English?
Yes, you can speak in English directly format and carefully.
I do not teach young children. I teach young adults. But am I wrong thinking that what you just said about the importance of establishing a safe place and a healthy relationship with joyful interactions with rules, of course, but making a positive environment is equally as important, or perhaps I won't say more important, but I think it's likely the same neuroscience behind the.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. When we are doing training and we have more time, Catherine does a number of slides on the brain and the different neurological pathways that are firing. And when people first start looking at the brain, there's the idea or the assumption that it's a traumatized child's brain. And then there's the understanding that it's a child's brain. And then finally, there's the understanding that it's everyone's brain. And what we're really describing during adolescence and at different stages, we seek connection in different places, but the ideas are universal.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it matters what age you are, you can still feel unsafe. And you can be still made to feel unsafe in a classroom if the teacher isn't giving out that sense of safety and becoming a safe base for you. If they're unpredictable, if they sound cross, if their face isn't friendly, if there's no routines, if they don't connect with you, I think it doesn't matter whatever age you are, you can still be thrown into feeling unsafe. But also, some of our young people have experienced trauma, in their early life, and for those children, they can be really triggered into their defense response very, very, very quickly. And it really doesn't matter what age you are. That will happen to you, and it's never too late to try to do something about that. So it's never too late to try to form a relationship with that young person so that they learn how to feel safe, and they learn how to depend on other people, and they learn how to trust, and they learn how to connect. So I think this is as relevant to, I don't know, university students as it is to kindergarten children, really.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Francisca, também penso que queria colocar uma pergunta.
See, it was actually kind of the same question almost, because I work a lot with teenagers or young adults, and my question was a bit more in the direction of when, like, some things we should learn as a child, like regulation, for example, and then if we haven't learned it as a child, maybe we need to continue to do this also with older people. So you already answered this, but maybe also the question if some things are at one point kind of learned, and then we as educators don't need to focus on this so much anymore.
Nice. That's a nice question.
I think that the very early years of life are a very sensitive period in terms of learning these things. But psychologists used to think that you learned them then, or you never learned them. But what we know now is that it's a sensitive period. It's not a critical period, and actually our brains go on changing all the way through life. So even a young person in their early 20s, or I don't know, late teens or teens, there's huge potential for bringing about change through relationship. you know, it is harder to do it when people are older, but it's never too late. And if you've got students who you're working with who are very dysregulated, you almost have to use this approach, because if you don't use this approach, they'll never learn, because they'll never be in that safe zone, you know, when they can learn. And then if you can do things to make them safe, when they're safe, if you can do things like focus on connection and focus on teaching them how to regulate, then you can make an enormous difference, even if they're much older.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Matt and Catherine. We also have here a question from Joana Rodrigues, and she's asking if you can give a practical example of how to deal with a situation of physical violence from one student to another in the classroom, and about the timing and the consequences
Yeah,
in
nice.
this situation.
I think it's so one of the things, a little bit like our model, although we don't think our model answers everything, but our model has 3 aspects to it. And so one is about everything that we do to develop relationships, develop safety, regulation, understanding, etc. One is about how we attempt to respond in a regulatory way in the moment. And the final part of the model is how we try to use really meaningful reparation in the aftermath. So the question is about what do we do in the moment? And I've already began to answer that by saying we attempt to make that situation safe. I think that the very first time that happens, particularly if it surprises us that there is an altercation between 2 students, we attempt to make that situation safe. We attempt first to be regulated ourselves. One of the things that happens when things are very difficult is we can become panicked ourselves. We don't quite know what to do. What's the procedure? What's happening? Am I on my own? And what we begin to do is, as we dysregulate, we lose access to really clear thinking. So attempting to retain some level of self-awareness to try and regulate ourselves in the moment, to try and make that situation safe. Once that situation has happened once, it has real implications for how do we work with those students to develop a secure relationship between them, to develop a sense of safety, to understand that there are boundaries in our school that are about keeping us safe. How do we try and plan for ensuring that we can respond in a way that feels, I don't know, like we have a plan? If we know that those 2 students have a difficult relationship, we might need a plan around them in terms of how we try to manage and regulate. And what's really important is when there is a time when those students are calm, we need to do some type of restorative work with them. Now, that might be initially, of course, doing work on their own individually before we attempt, and maybe in some circumstances we won't, but attempt to bring them together. I think for any incident that happens in schools, the first time it happens, we attempt to respond as best we can to make that situation safe. We attempt to be contained and calm ourselves, to be authoritative in that moment. That may involve raising our voice. That may involve projecting a sense of, I have got this. But once that incident has happened, we should think about it in 3 ways: the before, the during, and the after. And a combination of those 3 things might help us to try and reduce the likelihood of that happening again. We do feel as though there needs to be natural consequences when there have been big incidents. But those consequences, we shouldn't imagine that working out the punishment will make it less likely that it happens again. What the consequence might need to be is that those 2 students are showing us that they cannot be safe on the playground, in the corridor, in the same classroom. So the consequence will need to emerge in terms of enabling them to be safe. That might mean that they can't be together for a bit. It might mean that we need a different procedure in place. But the consequence won't be imagining that a punishment will sort it out. The consequence will be what learning needs to take place so that this is less likely to happen again in the future. I am aware that talking about it whilst two students are not punching each other is easier than knowing what to do in the moment. But I think having those three things in mind over time will be helpful. There isn't a neat answer in which I say, oh, there's a special jiu-jitsu move where you get them in like a neck lock and then it sorts it out.
Thank you, Matt. We have two more questions, Teresa Rocha and Bruno Rodrigues. Teresa, por favor.
Hello. So what I would like to, it's not to ask, but it's to say, is that with all of these that we have, well, I can say that I'm very empathic with my students, and I think well, what I see is that with all of this that I do, and I see that my students trust me and my students feel safe with me. And what I feel is that sometimes, most of the times, I'm working on these relationships instead of, for example, teaching my subject. So, and what I've been realizing this last, I don't know, but maybe 5-6 years is that this is what I do. Sometimes I don't teach anymore, you know. I know that I'm doing something, but sometimes I look and my students are teenagers and they are studying for exams. They are going to have national exams. And sometimes what I ask myself is, okay, but am I teaching anything? Am I doing something as far as my profession is concerned, as far as I don't know, it's just something for you to think and to reflect upon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a thought-provoking comment, and we really agree. And I guess one of the things that we feel is mine and Catherine's wish over time is to influence the wider education system to think about the type of skills that are needed by young people, and to think about how we need organizations like schools to be full of people who have a good understanding of this, as well as a good understanding of their subject area. And if children are experiencing what you described right from the word go in school, by the time they get to your lesson aged 15 or something, we hope that they have experienced quite a lot of the regulatory responses that enable them to be able to focus in your lessons, in part because they feel connected to you and they trust you. The school that we've worked with absolutely loads in Devon to attempt to become some type of beacon to show others have the same conversations that you are having with us.
I think really,
Thank you.
some of that also is about going back to that social control window. So I think sometimes when you're working in a relational approach, it can be quite hard to get that balance right. So you can find yourself being a bit too permissive and a bit too, so that it is really difficult. And I think that you have to think really carefully about how you become that authoritative figure in the classroom that is also relational. I mean, one of the things that we talk to our Devon schools about is making agreements with the students in the class. So you definitely start off every term by negotiating agreements. So this is how we need to be together in order to learn, and this is how we need to be together in order to all get on with each other. But the goal is always how we need to be able to be, so that we can learn, you know, so that becomes the primary thing. And when relationships break down and things aren't going well, you can come back to those core agreements about, you know, we're here to learn, this is happening and this is spoiling the learning. What are we going to do about that? What do we all need to enable us to do that? So I think having that circle time where you talk about agreements, I think, when I was a secondary school teacher, I found that a really, really, really helpful thing to have these agreements in place around learning, because I think it was really helpful in terms of getting that balance right, which is tricky.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
Very tricky. Thank you.
And I think we have the last question here in chat from Bruno Rodrigues. He asked, how can we raise awareness within the educational community about this issue, given that we are seeing an increasing number of students who are anxious, dependent on acceptance, and often lost in so much misinformation and pressure to achieve results? I think it's a tricky question too, and a difficult one.
What we've tried to do, we spent a lot of time in Devon working with schools who were very, very, very difficult to shift in their practice. And what we've been doing the last few years is working with schools who are really already on our side, if you see what I mean. And what we've been able to do in those schools is develop some really excellent practice, because we weren't battling them in terms of trying to persuade them to do it. They wanted to do it and they wanted to learn and work. And we've learned enormously from them as well. And I think together, we've created some schools that are very relational, and I think that's been really helpful, because people now look at those schools and think, oh, they're doing something different, and they're also very successful schools.
And the
So
staff are happy in those schools.
And the staff are happy, the students are happier, and the parents are happier. And I think that's made an enormous difference in Devon, because other schools are looking, thinking, what are they doing that's different? What we've also tried to do, as we've been doing that, is do some research. So we've had some trainee educational psychologists who have been doing interviews with parents and students and teachers, so that we can actually write up some research to actually show that this way is very effective. It's very difficult politically, though. We don't know what the situation is in Portugal, but perhaps now we've got a new government, recent new government, things might be different, but we've had real difficulty in shifting, what the Department of Education's line is on this, because it's been very authoritarian. But we do have a Labour government now, which might shift things a bit, but watch this space, because they haven't done anything yet.
Well, I believe we have a wonderful webinar, and I think we reflected upon several key strategies to promote more inclusive future. And I get an expression you use that I think it's really, really great. That is, what doesn't get repaired gets repeated. So I think this is really, really relevant. I think we can go home and think about this, because we have a way, and today we discussed several strategies so we can shift here in Portugal from a traditional way of looking at behavior and managing behavior to a more evidence-based strategy that focus on care, that focus on protection, that focus on connection and understanding. So we have the keys, we heard you, and I think now it's up to us to start seeing in our own schools, in our own context, how we can improve this kind of change. So thank you very, very much for your disponibility to be here with us and to share with us your experience that will guide us in our contest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you.
It was really great. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you.
A todos uma boa tarde e esperamos ver-nos em breve novamente.
Boa tarde.
Boa semana.
Obrigada. Boa tarde.